So I finally beat Tales of Arise. I'd like to tell a little story about my history with the Tales of series. I vividly remember playing Tales of Symphonia on the GameCube on co-op with one of my best friends who lived next door to me at the time. Years later, some friends I would make via conventions and cosplaying who were fans of Final Fantasy and other JRPGs introduced me to the rest of the Tales series, which had been continuing for years at that time. Unfortunately, that dear friend who introduced me to such games as Graces and Exelia went their separate ways from me. So I started to fall out of love with the series. I doubt I'll ever finish such games as Abyss, Graces, or Zestiria, but I know I'll always be able to go back to Symphonia and Exelia, and I have a feeling I'll enjoy Berseria as well when I finally get around to that one. My love for this series was reignited with the announcement of Tales of Arise. I immediately fell in love with the character designs. They are some of the most aesthetically pleasing designs of any modern JRPG I can recall in recent memory. That, accompanied by a more dark fantasy tone for the story, made it seem much more appealing than the likes of Graces or Zestiria to me. I played the game a little bit on launch, but put it down because I wanted to finish some other games first. But I knew I was going to love this game. I beat the second main story boss, the Light Lord, and crossed this event horizon where I stopped being merely invested in the game and became completely addicted, which is probably why it took so long to get the Dark of the Moon video done, but don't worry about it. For the first time in a long time with a JRPG, I genuinely could not put the game down until I finished it. I played it for a few hours a day for about 2 weeks and just binged it until I finally finished it. So what did I think? It's not only my favorite game in the Tales series, but it might be the best action RPG I've ever played, beating out Kingdom Hearts 2 from that spot. From the beautifully animated anime cutscenes by Ufotable, to the music, to the stunning art design, to the gameplay, to the English voice acting, I loved nearly everything about this game. It isn't perfect, no game really is, and I will discuss some problems I had with it, but overall I could not give it a more glowing recommendation. Here's my spoiler-free review. In terms of visuals, the art direction literally could not be better. I already gushed about the character designs, but the environment designs are beautiful too. There are many varied environments based on different elements, a staple of JRPGs of course, but I spent a non-insignificant amount of time in this game just rotating my camera around and gazing at the environments around me, especially when I entered a new area. It reminds me of that feeling of wonder I first felt exploring some of Final Fantasy XIII's environments. That game really pushed the 7th gen to its limits in terms of graphical fidelity, and I feel like this game does the same for the 8th generation. It, along with Dragon Quest XI, I feel like are the truest representations of what a classic JRPG series should look like in the modern era. I say that without having actually played Final Fantasy XVI yet, as I don't own a PS5. This is a technically demanding game. It does not have a Switch port, and I feel like the visual performance benefits from that. It's able to be a cut above games that do have Switch ports and have to have more simplistic visuals as a result. Games like Ys 9, SMT5, or even the Xenoblade games. This game runs incredibly smooth on PS4 Pro, aside from some very occasional frame rate stutters in the overworld where there's a lot of particle effects on screen. Battles never dipped in performance the entire game. I see no reason to advocate people pick this up on PS5 specifically for performance, but I don't doubt that it runs even better over there. To gush about the characters one final time, the cutscenes have a lot of dynamic character movement and some very expressive eyes and faces. The hair is also wonderfully textured as well. They have some of the most consistently good-looking anime-style characters I can think of in a modern game. The gameplay felt like a huge improvement over the previous Tales games that I've played. The real-time combat in the Tales series happens in a pseudo-3D environment where you can't typically move in any direction. You can only move in and out, towards and away from the enemy, so to speak. This was initially to keep in line with the original 2D Tales of Phantasia on the Super Nintendo, but to be able to move in true 3D here in Tales of Arise is such a welcome change. Allegedly, Arise was made with the idea of breaking from series tradition deliberately in mind, which I certainly appreciated. You can command each character and adapt to their unique playstyle, but the game puts a lot of emphasis on playing as Alphen, and he's very fun to play as. Being able to chain arts together to air juggle enemies never quite gets old. In addition, the gameplay progression is very well paced as well. You understand the basics of combat thoroughly before the game gives you a full party. Once you have each of the game's 6 characters is when the gameplay really opens up and becomes extremely addicting. Shortly after that is when you're able to have a second set of equipped arts you can toggle between, allowing for even more diverse and complex combos without having to go into your menu and readjust your setup. It's incredible. I learned way too late into the game you're also able to manually disable in the menu certain arts your allies will use, only leaving the ones remaining which correspond to the element the enemies are weak to. This was very helpful in the final area of the game where Xion and Rinwell were exploiting every single enemy's weakness automatically, making some otherwise very hard fights much more trivial. I do have some gripes with the gameplay. The game has a weird relationship to money, healing items, and boss difficulty. I played this game on the normal difficulty, and there were moments I was tempted to change the difficulty down to the story mode, the easy mode. But I managed to stave off this temptation and see the game through to the end without ever changing the difficulty. Unlike most JRPGs, I would say about 85% of the bosses in this game took me multiple attempts to kill. The second Lord fight, the Light Lord, is a massive skill check and a difficulty curve that may wall your progress in the early game. I got very frustrated at one point because I felt like it was the same song and dance with every boss. Chip away at their outrageous health pool while avoiding attacks that will likely one-shot your characters and pray you have enough healing and revival items to make it through the fight. It speaks back to my general problem with action RPGs in general, which is the moment you add input precision into the equation, it stops being about your level, stats, and equipment, and starts being about how effectively you can dodge one-hit kill attacks, which still makes for engaging gameplay, but it just makes me want to play a character action game like Devil May Cry, and prefer turn-based RPGs like Dragon Quest and early Final Fantasy to these action RPGs. During the fight against Dohalim, he one-shot 3 of my 4 characters with a single attack. I just had to pause the game and start laughing at the sheer unfairness of the situation. There were also at least 3 to 4 story bosses where I was completely out of healing and revival items with only the character I was controlling left alive, chipping away at the boss's health and avoiding these instant death attacks. The most hilarious example of this was the Wind Lord, where the only character left alive was Xion, and the boss was in the last fourth of their health, about 25,000, and I had to take out this boss by dealing chip damage while she spammed her AoE super attack, which luckily was unable to hit the very edges of the arena, so I was safe from damage. It just seemed comical that this boss spammed its most powerful attack at least 20 times in the final phase, while I dealt chip damage to it, unable to be killed but unable to revive any of my other party members. It just felt cheap, random, and silly. The general grindiness of bosses in this game I feel like can be attributed to a modern RPG design sensibility. So many games these days feel like they need to be a second job for you. It's like the only game you get to play. So many RPGs brag about how long they are and how much content they have. Games like the Persona series and the Xenoblade series boasting about their 80 to 100 hour playtime. I personally do not enjoy this. I know from experience that some of the Persona games can justify their length by virtue of not being able to have a post-game after the final boss, making the final boss the very last thing you can do. I don't have the time to commit to a game that long nowadays, and I generally feel like shorter games often have a more tightly crafted experience. SMT Nocturne and Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age are 2 RPGs that I've finished in the last couple of years, and they both clock in around the 35 to 40 hour mark without side content or post-game content. Hell, SMT Soul Hacker is one of my favorite Shin Megami Tensei games, is only about 15 hours long, and that was an extremely finely tuned and crafted experience. I'll come back to this discussion of length when we get to the story, but suffice it to say, I feel like the intended way to play this game was to do as many side quests as possible that they offered you in a particular area to gain as much money as possible, blow your entire wallet on healing and revival items just so you can have a chance at surviving the next story boss. Often these side quests are hunts against high-level monsters that will be much stronger than you, and you cannot beat right now regardless, or it will also take up all of your healing items to beat, rendering them not worth fighting. It's reasons like this that I don't enjoy games like Monster Hunter. I do not enjoy a lot of redundant resource gathering and grindy fights that do not advance the story. I believe the game knows it's too grindy, and this arrangement is intentional. The DLC store for the game, in addition to offering you some additional difficulty levels for free, some BGM, and some cosmetics for the characters, offers you the ability to purchase a limited amount of level ups and money drops with real-world money. So if someone is stuck in the game and doesn't like grinding, they can spend another $2 and gain 10 levels. But my general disapproval and condemnation of microtransaction and gacha games really bounced off of this decision. But to be charitable, it was probably something mandated by the publisher. However, thankfully this difficulty issue does appear to drop off in the last quarter of the game. I noticed many of the bosses in the final 25% of the game I was actually able to defeat on the first try. I had a lot more money, access to purchasing better quality CP restoration items, as well as better equipment, so presumably my characters were able to more easily tank fatal blows. Not to mention the skill that lets a character live a lethal blow on 1 health prevented me from wiping out to as many bosses in the late game. I just feel like in the first 50% of the game, bosses are a huge chore, and you are extremely limited by fewer abilities, little money, and a more strict supply of good healing items. Although the final area of the game does have its own share of problems. Most of the encounters at that point are reskinned boss-type enemies that use the same moves and are incredibly grindy and time-consuming to kill, resulting in me just running past a lot of them. At some point, I plan to replay this game with my wife and our best friend, and I wouldn't be opposed to playing the game on the easiest difficulty for that run just to enjoy the story and cut down on grinding, especially if one of them wants the controller for that group playthrough. I will absolutely not subject them to the frustration I felt, even though I feel like in the end, it was rewarding and extremely worth it to finish the game on the harder normal mode. Side note here, and this part is unscripted, since writing this, I have gone back and played more of the post-game content, and I have experimented with the 2 free DLC difficulties. So they added a very easy mode and a super hard mode called Unknown. And it's interesting what changes here. What changes between the difficulty modes is mainly enemy HP and your score multiplier, which is what goes towards your drops at the end of fights. It doesn't change how much XP is given or anything like that, and there's no penalty for story progression or trophy progress by changing difficulties in-game. So in theory, what you could do is grind off a bunch of enemies on the super hard unknown difficulty to get really good item drops, and then drop the difficulty back down to very easy to be able to clean house with the bosses. There's really nothing in the game preventing you from doing this, which might be a serious balance oversight. Let me know what you guys think. A friend of mine beat the game by applying these methods and experimenting around with the difficulty modes at his leisure, so I'm just not entirely sure how I feel about that. Without going into spoilers, the story in this game is incredibly satisfying. With any JRPG, the characters are usually the most defining part of the story. The story doesn't work without compelling characters, and the format of a long RPG allows the characters to grow gradually over a long story. It's a storytelling format that allows you to very intimately get to know these characters and watch them grow, change, and learn new things. This game does all of that spectacularly. The characters behave completely differently by the end of the game than they did when you first met them. They go through an immense amount of growth over the story. Grudges are let go of, trauma is healed, lots of forgiveness is had. It's great. It's an unlikely crew of people who always thought they deserved to be alone for one reason or another until they found each other. Alphen is surprisingly emotionally mature for a guy who's lost all his memories. He's incredibly empathetic and a good listener, and he helps people through their problems by asking the right questions and giving them an unbiased, non-judgmental point of view. I felt a strong kinship to Alphen that I haven't felt for an RPG protagonist in a very long time. Shion is one of the most well-written tsundere I've ever seen in fiction. All of her hostility and coldness at the beginning of the story, every single bit of it is justified when you learn about her actual backstory later on. She also grows significantly as a character, and unlike most tsundere you see in anime, let's say, doesn't stay bitchy the entire time and allows the events of the story to recontextualize her worldview and her experiences. Rinwell, Law, and Dohalim also have great character arcs, and each start off being pretty unlikable when you first meet them, but all of them have their moment of growth and become immensely more likable once they've had their moment. Kisara I found to be very endearing. She starts off like the rest of the cast with a lot of baggage, but I love that she's optimistic without being naive. She's incredibly smart and has high hopes for the future of this world and holds a conviction to her values. There are a lot of scenes that are sort of played up for comedy with her, like her being the mom of the group, by being the only one with life skills like how to cook and do laundry. But after that one scene, it's never brought up again and she's allowed to have a personality outside of that. Same thing when the cast accuses her of basically simping for Dohalim. The rest of the cast calls her out for how she's being overly protective of him. She acknowledges her behavior and then leaves him alone. She treats him like an equal for the rest of the game. This could have easily been played up for laughs or for fan service, where Kisara has a crush on the pretty princely lord accommodated by a bunch of will they, won't they bullshit. But rather, they allow her character to be about so much more, and and I really appreciated the way in which she's characterized. The plot is also overall very good. It comes dangerously close to saying something profound when it comes to sociocultural and political commentary, but it's a very non-committal, and in my opinion, is too entrenched in its own fiction to make any meaningful real-world social commentary. It comes very close, but it's kind of wishy-washy about its message. Obviously, things like slavery is bad, racism is bad, caste systems are bad, unjust social hierarchies are bad, humans are all created equal, and things we fight over on the basis of race are technically arbitrary but are deeply rooted in our cultural context based on the actions of generations that came before us. All these things the story says loud and clear, and we can all get behind. But some of the events of the story pose some interesting questions. Like in the case of Dohalim, do you confront the question of, do you condemn authoritarianism if the authoritarian is a quote-unquote good person? Or is there any difference between being a slave and being free if you're part of a social hierarchy where access to wealth and power is regulated by those who already have it, thus keeping it in the hands of the few and permanently out of the hands of those who need it, creating a system where the poor and middle class always are the victim of a rigged system, and the fruits of their labor and suffering always funnel upwards to those who already have everything? This game doesn't aggressively confront these things, and I suppose it doesn't have to. It does a great job of telling the story within the context of its fictional setting. It's just hard to tell a story that includes things like slavery, racism, and caste systems without people making real-world parallels. I'm not confident that the writers were prepared to be confronted with the nature of the subject matter that they were introducing into their own story. But I would love to hear what someone has to say who is more politically and historically literate than myself, who has played the game multiple times and really analyzed the story in terms of these themes, and see what they think. Overall, the game's message is, people's differences are arbitrary and we should strive to coexist even if it means forgiving each other for our preconceived hatred. It's a good message, and the story's emphasis on friendship and having people close to you that you can trust is very heartwarming. I do feel like the story suffers slightly in the third act, due to a lot of long exposition dumps that really change the status quo of how we thought this world worked. And I'm not completely sold on a lot of the events in the last third, but the finale was fantastic. It's a beautiful story, and I loved mostly every minute of it. Minor spoiler, but the game does sort of a fake-out ending around the 35-hour mark, when I thought the game could have easily ended. I was not initially thrilled with the idea that there was an entire other arc of the game after that, but most of the content in that last section of the game was good. The characters continued to grow, and it was well worth it for the actual ending. I initially finished the game without doing much of the endgame or side content at around the 53-hour mark, and I was level 48 when I cleared the final boss. At some point I will go back and finish the late game optional content, and I'll know that that will put me over like the 70-hour mark. So overall, I'm not disappointed in the game's length. If it was closer to 40 hours, I would have been fine with that too, but I was very satisfied with the 53-ish hours that I put in, and I would only cut out some very minimal stuff from the last arc to make the story and pace flow a little bit better. Again, side note, unscripted edit here. Again, since I've written this, I have gone back and done more of the post-game content, and I am now at level 70, and I will say that the post-game content is definitely worth it. I probably would advocate going for the way that I did things if you're ready just to see the ending, but the side content for the endgame does have additional character development. So there are scenes that kind of resolve certain characters' arcs, and it does give you an opportunity to do more of like the campfire conversations to really kind of wrap up your relationship with those characters. Also, because I love this game so much, I've already decided that I'm going to go through and try to get the Platinum Trophy for this. Not something that I do with very many games at all, unless I really, really love them, and the Platinum Trophy is doable. And looking at all of the content that's required for that, it's basically just 100% all of the required content in the game. There's nothing really out of the ordinary you have to do to get that. And so if you're aiming for the Platinum Trophy, you're going to see all of the intended created content that way. So I definitely recommend going that way. Well, that about concludes my thoughts on Tales of Arise. I love this game to pieces, and I don't hesitate putting it somewhere between my top 15 and 20 games of all time. Side note, post-production here, I decided where it goes. It is my 12th favorite game of all time. That's right, it is number 12 out of my top 15. I loved it just that much. This video is just a recording of a transcript that I wrote off of my Blogspot review of the game, So I am writing text reviews for games and other media that I finish. It's just sort of a side project I'm working on in addition to this channel. So if you guys enjoyed this, definitely go check out the Blogspot account and read some of my text reviews over there. I have one for Soul Hackers 2 as well, which I finished earlier this year. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.